I'm Metta Spencer, and I'm going to have a conversation with somebody I dearly respect and appreciate, Kai Brand-Jacobsen. I believe it's Morehouse College, which is Martin Luther King's alma mater, gave you an award.
It's actually was the Martin Luther King Gandhi Ikeda Community Builders Award that's given out by Morehouse College, which was King's alma mater. And it wasn't as much one specific event or contribution, as much as a recognition and an award given for the breadth of engagement in peace building over more than 20 years now. But from my point of view, the way I experienced and received the award was very much as a recognition and award to our field, because it's something that isn't about the work of any single individual, but in reality, over the past 20 years, we have seen an incredible growth of the peace building field and tens of thousands of people who are involved and working in it from many different angles, from people working directly on the ground in their communities, like where I was coming from just now in Northeast Nigeria, meeting with local community elders, youth, women involved in community response networks to try and deal with violence and conflicts within and between communities there, to people working in reconciliation processes, in mediation, in civilian or UN peacekeeping, and also people in governments. There's an increasing engagement by many governments all over the world, some of which have even created ministries or departments of peace to try and bring forward proven and effective ways of dealing with conflicts.
Well, okay. I should have actually introduced you more formally because you are the head of the Department of Peace Operations of something called PATRIR. And that's an acronym, PATRIR. Believe it or not, I was looking to try to find out what that acronym stands for, and I never did find it on anything, anything I have written around here. So you're going to have to spell it out. What is this organization? I know this much. You founded it.
PATRIR stands for the Peace Action, Training and Research Institute of Romania. It's the Romanian Peace Institute. I was one of a team of founders, and then the organization has been built by the engagement of many, many colleagues throughout nearly 18 years now, both from across Romania and also from all over the world. And the name is actually very important because when the Institute was created, it was developing both to address conditions within the country in Romania, but also very much to engage globally. And we were looking at many of the top peace institutes in the world at that time, who we had great respect for. But one of the challenges was that many of them were engaging purely in research and often were not as active to be involved in actually addressing conflict situations or working in peace building in the world. So the Institute does have the research component. That's a critical element of what we do, and very much what we call operational research, working to learn from the front of the field and what's being done on the ground to improve and inform policy and practice. But we're also very strongly engaged directly in action. We actually work only upon invitation and request. We never set up offices, and we almost never apply for funds to work anywhere else in the world. Our rule is that we have to be invited, we have to be asked to be there, and the funds have to be controlled by our partners within the countries we engage in, so that they actually have the power to decide, and they can have us there as long as they feel that what we're doing is useful and contributing. But our aim is never to have the PATRIR logo or the PATRIR name visible, but instead to actually support what people are doing in their own countries. And as Gandhi said, guided by the belief that peace building is best done by local people in our own communities. And then the T in PATRIR, training, is also a critical part of what we do as an institute. What we saw nearly 20 years ago and what we're still seeing today is that while the number of people engaging in the field has increased dramatically, the number of people that are actually properly and professionally trained to know how to do peace building, to know how to engage in mediation and peace processes, or how to work on early warning and effective prevention, or how to address the individual personal and the societal experience of violence, and to work with healing and trauma and reconciliation. The number of people that actually have those skills in the world is incredibly low. And at the same time, many people who are in key positions, from senior political leadership to working right on the front lines with local authorities, community organizations, or security services, often have a training and a skill set which actually is the opposite of what's needed, or might mean that the responses that we have for dealing with conflicts actually make the situation worse. So a huge engagement of the Institute, both at our Global Academy here in Cluj, through executive leadership programs in London and elsewhere, and then our on-request trainings, which are done all over the world. A huge focus is to help to support frontline practitioners and policymakers to have the critical skills, knowledge, and capabilities they need to do peace building effectively.
You know, I'm going to start with a really difficult question. I don't want to throw you in the deep end, but here we go. Because the question that occurs to me immediately is, if you are there at the request of some kind of officialdom, what is your position with respect to insurgent groups or people who want to get rid of a dictatorship or what they consider a dictatorship, et cetera? Are you always on the side of the government that invited you in?
So we are by as broad a range of stakeholders as you could possibly imagine. And sometimes it is governments and ministries. Very often it is UN missions and agencies. And sometimes it's by individual citizens. There was one occasion amongst many where we received a phone call, and the first, "My city is burning, can you help us?" And our response was, "We will do all that we can." And within 72 hours, we had a team on the ground in that situation. And we're engaging in the midst of a very escalated conflict to try and help de-escalate it and then work to find real solutions. No, what we do is affected by who invites us, to the extent that it plays a role in shaping the level at which you engage and the approach that you take. But no matter who invites us, our principles and our practice are always consistent. So for example, if we're invited in by a government which is in conflict with organizations or groups within the society, what we do is to engage with that government and engage with as broad a range of stakeholders as possible to really help to bring about an understanding of what is actually underlying the conflict, what are the root causes and the drivers behind it, what are the issues which have given rise to it, and then to work with them to help them see how they will benefit from bringing about an effective solution and actually addressing the real issues of what the conflict is about. And that's critical, because very often the approach governments will take is to name and demonize whichever organization or group might be in conflict or contesting with them. And for example, in Nepal, what you saw was the government for years called it a Maoist problem. In Colombia, the government called it a FARC problem. So they're defining not any issue, not any underlying driver or cause, but the actual group itself as the problem giving rise to the conflict. And then part of what will be our ethical responsibility and practice as an institute is to really engage with them to identify what are the broader dynamics and the underlying issues which have given rise to this specific group and given rise to the conflict, to help them see what are practical and effective ways of addressing it, and to reflect upon the experiences within the country itself, as well as elsewhere, to really make visible what happens when you don't deal with the conflict effectively. So one thing that we do with governments is really draw out the economic, the social, the human impact of failing to address conflicts effectively, and also to try and get them to become champions of a solution, not to try and convince them, but to really identify what are their own interests, what is it that will motivate them, so that they become the ones who are actively working to bring forward practical and
perfect if that works. But I wonder, it doesn't seem to me it's always in the cards. I don't know. It seems to me that oftentimes you might be invited in, or somebody might be invited in, by a group of people who feel that the only solution is to oust the government. And I'm thinking, for example, of the situation in Venezuela right now, where half of the people I know, there's a big controversy going on Facebook, on my timeline, because half of my friends think I'm something awful, and the other half, I think otherwise. So we are not clear about whether or not Guaido or Maduro should be supported. In a situation of that kind, I wonder if you still think it's possible to work toward reconciliation of the two sides and getting them to cooperate and find some sort of, happy common ground, or if it's a little bit too late for that.
We're talking about real solutions to actual conflicts, which meet the needs of the parties involved. And quite often that can involve changing individuals in different roles. I think in Venezuela, the overwhelming majority of the population is not actually enthusiastic about either of these men. At the same time, they may be representing blocs which those who are supporting them have very legitimate issues. So many of those who may align to a certain extent with the government, there are some who do so obviously out of their own interests and really deeply embedded corruption within the regime and power structures within the regime. And that's absolutely true. But also there are very many citizens who feel that the current, but even more so the previous government, did champion their rights and issues in a country, in a context where those were often ignored. There are also very many citizens who really feel ignored, excluded, even attacked by the current and the former regime. And what's critical is not only to look at these two old men who are at the height of political alignment.
Pretty young. Those guys are
so young, and their structures both embedded within different competing elite rivalries, both supported by an array of different foreign countries and external actors, and neither one really authentically acting in the interests of their population or the country. I think what's needed then is to broaden the discussion, to engage far more actors. Something that's critical is, one, peacebuilding is not necessarily something that's fast. It can take a deep engagement in conflict to work to bring about effective solutions. You could see in the case of South Africa, that was a transition that took place over decades. And it was something that required both the rejection of unjust structures that could not continue, and then trying to find something new which could address the legitimate needs and interests of all the different sectors in the society. And South Africa is actually a very powerful example because it shows both how effective that can be, but also that it is not something that is achieved as a one-off. You need to continue after. And whether it is situations like governance transition in South Africa or situations of recovery after war, one of the major challenges that we face is the moment the Mandela is released from prison, the moment there's a peace agreement between parties, we treat it as if we've succeeded, and we haven't. That is just a beginning. It's an extraordinary moment when the guns fall silent, when you have a change in regime. But all of the problems which have existed in that society, in that country, continue. And finding solutions to them is a work of years and decades. Mm-hmm. And that's why we actually need to build up the capabilities within countries and within governments for sustained stabilization and peace building. And that means everything from introducing peace education in schools so that an entire country and an entire society is developing the knowledge and the skills and capabilities to deal with conflicts effectively, to building the actual capabilities of institutions and governments to find solutions to the real problems facing our countries.
I agree 1,000% with that. And in fact, I have sort of gone through an evolution of my own thinking about how much I want to encourage, or not that my encouragement matters to anybody, but how much how I feel about efforts to for regime change when the regime certainly needs to be changed, because I've seen so many cases where it has not worked. And people are not prepared yet for the kind of democracy that they have achieved. I mean, once the dictator goes, you think you're home free, but you're certainly not. The work is just beginning. And I wonder to what extent, Kai, that kind of work could begin while the dictator's still in power. I'm thinking, for example, well, I can think easily of Trump right now, but I was originally brought to this question by thinking about Russia and the fact that, my Russian friend said, well, if we got rid of Putin, they'd just bring another one even worse to power right away because people are not used to democracy, have no idea how to make it work, etc. And I'm thinking, maybe they're right. I mean, I didn't believe it for a long time, but suppose they're right that that there's got to be some preparation before you can expect that kind of transition. And I don't even know whether that kind of preparation is possible in a situation where the government simply won't allow NGOs or civil society, or certainly foreign people like you and me, to go in and participate. Tell me, what can be done in that kind of situation against, let's say, against the wishes of the regime?
I think the first thing for me that jumps out, I always have a reaction when I hear people say people are not ready for democracy, or those people are not ready for this or that. I don't see
well, looky here. I'm not even going that far. I'm saying we're not ready for democracy. People I know have been fumbling the ball, but my friends and you and maybe me, all of us, and we've not carried through very well with some of the things that we were trying to do.
Even here across Eastern Europe, if you look at what was happening in 89, 90, 91, 92, the hope that came out of that, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then you look at what we have today, decades later, 30 years later, we have the rise of authoritarian regimes across the region, and extraordinarily corrupt and often incompetent governments, not everywhere, but across a huge amount, of extreme right movements in Germany, France, across most of Western Europe as well. But my point of view is, it's not necessarily that people are not ready for democracy. It's that when you are going through deep changes in the society, which has come out of the context of certain types of regimes or systems over years and decades, then just because you change the name on the door or you remove the individual who's sitting in the office of the president, the power structures, the inequalities in economic wealth, control of the means of production, control of media and communication, those all still remain. The ideas, the attitudes, everything built up over years and decades still remain. And the challenge is what happens during these very often chaotic and confusing transitions, as we saw also in Egypt and across the Middle East and North Africa following the Arab Spring, in those countries in which there was transition, is people who are very well placed work to capture the state. We've seen that betrayed in South Africa by those who took over after Mandela. We've seen that betrayed across Eastern Europe, across the Middle East and North Africa. And part of the reasons are, it's not only about the momentary shift, the change in government, the signing of a peace agreement, it's about the deep work which comes after. And what we have seen in many countries is you've had then social, political, economic reforms, which are actually continued and implemented, often in very non-democratic ways. They're not necessarily transparent. They're not openly engaged with or discussed. And the reality is, in many countries, the actual conditions for people after don't necessarily improve. You can actually look across the world now, Brazil, the Philippines, China, Russia, Turkey, Hungary, the number of authoritarian men in positions of governance that seem to be taking us back decades. We almost have a reaction as if this is an abnormality, an aberration. How could this happen? But the reality is, it's not. It is a culmination of the actual problems in our societies that have built up over years and decades and that are not being addressed. And also the result of very organized groups who are championing the movements which these individuals in some way become figureheads for. We are facing a deep and critical challenge to the rights and freedoms that have been won in our societies over years and decades. We've actually begun at PATRIR a European peacebuilding program over the last several years, because the similarity in the headlines in newspapers and media reports today across much of Europe to what they were in the 1930s is too extreme to ignore. Mm-hmm. And that was actually part of my background and beginning in this entire field over 20 years ago. Really? Was significantly shaped both by the context of the Cold War, but also growing up learning about the Second World War and about the Holocaust, and the need as citizens, as governments, as people in the world, when something like this is happening, to not remain silent, to not stand by on the sidelines as these changes are taking place, but the need and the responsibility of every single one of us to engage actively. And it's really about asking ourselves, what is the type of community, the type of society, the type of world we want to live in? And today we can see, whether it's looking at these crises we're facing in many of our countries and governments, to the crisis of global warming, and it's not only climate change, but it is climate crisis, and also the collapse of species in the world, brought about in large part by human activity. These are not issues which give you the option to simply sit back or go about life as normal.
And they're not there are things that we can't say, well, I'm going to pick this problem and solve it. I can only do one thing. Unfortunately, we've got to do them all.
It's both unfortunate and fortunate, because actually the answer to many of the problems is also similar. So we're not dealing with isolated issues in silos. These are dynamic, interconnected, and they are systems challenges. They are challenges which are coming up from the very social, economic, political systems, the way we're doing things. But the beauty, or the potential also, is that the answer comes about in finding a shift in the way we're doing things. And that's not unusual. We've done that throughout our entire existence as a species. Where there's a brilliant book which was written a few years ago by Rebecca da Costa called The Watchmen's Rattle. And in it, one of the things that Rebecca looks at is, why is it that what we've considered the greatest civilizations throughout history have all collapsed? So you look at the Khmer civilization, the Mayan, the Roman Empire, the Soviet Empire, the American Empire, the British Empire. Why have all of these different civilizations and empires, some of which existed for 100 years, some of which existed for thousands of years, and they were seen as the greatest civilizations because of their governance, their science, their learning, their economic, agricultural, cultural systems. And yet, every one of them eventually collapsed, or is in the process of collapsing. And she looks at the answers that are given by academics and experts around the world. And some of them say it's because of the corruption that has come up in their government system. Some say it's because of constant wars on the frontiers, or over-exploitation and destruction of the environment and their natural resource base. And her point is that, to varying extent, these answers are all correct. It varies the exact combination dynamics in the different cases. But what she then goes on to say is that the challenge with focusing so exclusively on what were the reasons that these societies collapsed is we sometimes then forget to ask the question, why didn't they solve it? Mm-hmm. In none of these cases were these problems that came up overnight. In none of these cases were these issues things that those in the societies were unaware of.
Yeah.
They knew of these problems and systematically failed to find solutions. And her book is called The Watchmen's Rattle, drawing upon this idea of during the Middle Ages in Europe, the watchman in a town who would have a wooden rattle, and when people were breaking in and stealing cattle, or if a fire was breaking out, they would shake the rattle and say, citizens, something is happening. Something is happening that we need to respond to. Mm-hmm. And that is where we are in the world today.
We are indeed. And I love the fact that you are pointing out how systemic the whole thing is, that all of these things are interdependent, and by solving one, we're working on the others pretty much as a whole package. I think it has to be addressed as a whole package.
And this is one of the powerful things that inspires me about peace building, because, I mean, one challenge we face in the world is the overwhelming majority of people have no idea what we mean when we say the word peace building. If I say soldier, bomber, rape, tank, everyone has a very clear visual image in their mind. I can speak about genocide, Holocaust, rape, murder, killing, and you can do academic studies in them and graduate thesis at master's or doctoral levels. That's seen as credible. We're still in a world today and an intellectual and academic situation where when you speak about peace building, very many people, one, have no idea what it means, and even in many universities around the world, it wouldn't be taken seriously. So proven and effective ways of addressing conflict are not taken seriously, while instruments and mechanisms that lead to the deaths of millions or billions are considered academically credible and worthy of academic papers, instead of looking at how we actually find solutions.
You are actually in the field all the time. I have a hard time catching you at home because you're out traveling the world. I think you were in Africa last week. I think you've been working in Nepal. I think you've got operations going on in Syria, etc. Tell us fairly concretely what in the world you do when you're out there building peace.
So one first thing to say is that peace building as a field is like medicine. So in the same way in medicine, you'll have an eye doctor, a neurosurgeon, a family doctor, you'll have someone trained in CPR, you'll have ambulance drivers who do emergency response. You have an entire architecture because there's no one thing you do when you're dealing with medicine. There are many specific, concrete, practical measures depending upon the situation. It is the exact same in peace building. So what we do in a different situation might in one case be working on mediation and bringing parties that have a specific dispute together. And then we look at also what makes mediation and peace processes work, what makes them fail, how can we do it effectively. And you can study that in the exact same way you can study neurosurgery or to be a general practitioner. There are skills, tools, an incredible body of knowledge. In Northeast Nigeria, we're working with a fantastic organization there called Search for Common Ground. It's one of the big organizations in the world working in peace building. Incredible staff, I imagine, of thousands all over the world, really working to bring peace building and effective solutions to conflict forward. And they engage on the ground in communities to work with their partners, from local communities to working with the government. So what we were doing, for example, in Northeast Nigeria, they have a peace architecture, as we'd call it, which is working on early warning. They have local committees on the ground in the most conflict and violence affected communities. And right in a remote village in the midst of conflicts with Boko Haram or conflicts between herder and farmer communities, the members of that community, elders, religious leaders, youth, women, different individuals within the community who have the trust of different community members, they will come together in what's essentially a local peace committee. And you'll have that local peace committee at the most on the ground level in communities that can sometimes take hours and hours, even days to drive to and to reach to from major cities. And then several of those communities, they'll go up to another level where they'll bring representatives together in a community security architecture that will have people from local authorities, from police, security services, community members, religious leaders, and then all of those add up to a statewide peace and development architecture. And these bodies bring together representatives from all the different critical institutions, ministries of interior, ministries of agriculture, security services, civil society organizations, women's groups, youth groups. And in Northeast Nigeria, as in most countries around the world, this architecture, these bodies which actually bring all these different actors to sit in one room together and discuss the issues, use their different sources of information to understand what the problems are, how they can make sense of it, see who's involved, what are the issues driving it, and then work together to find solutions. In most countries, that doesn't exist. All of the different actors and institutions work separately. They analyze information separately. They don't coordinate. They don't come together. So our architecture for addressing the most critical issues that we face in our communities is often not very well developed. And then,
do they actually get Boko Haram to attend these things?
No. So in this case, Boko Haram is legally designated by the government as a terrorist organization. So it's not even legally possible. But one of the things that we are trying to do within these structures is to work with the security services, the army, the government, and other actors to recognize Boko Haram is a manifestation of a deeper problem. Mm-hmm. Boko Haram came up out of conditions which were fundamentally wrong and challenging. And even if you were to overcome a single organization like Boko Haram, if the conditions are still there, the conflict will remain. And the other side of it is that the response of the government to Boko Haram strongly driven and actively supported by Western governments, by the United States, by European countries and others, flooding in weapons, flooding in money for supporting the war, flooding in military assistance to the army and to security actors. That response has in most cases made the situation worse as well. And in fact, security actors have killed more civilians than Boko Haram. So what happened?
I'm surprised, but you know, I've heard that the same thing can be said of Afghanistan. That there are more Taliban now than there were before 9/11 and before the invasion. So this counterterrorism approach has not worked. But is that what you're saying? Would you call what they've been doing in Nigeria a counterterrorism approach? Or has there been an effort to try to deal with and approach some of the people who are loyal to or persuaded by Boko Haram? If there are people, I don't know. Are there?
In Afghanistan, as in Northeast Nigeria, you have a situation where in some cases teachers have not been paid for a year. Civil servants have not been paid for several months to a year. There's almost no investment in addressing the actual developmental and economic livelihoods, jobs, needs. You've got huge youth populations where the education systems are very challenged. They see little or no opportunities for the future. And then we're investing billions and billions in war, which is fueling violence and destruction. The reality is, military violence as an instrument for addressing actual conflicts is one of the most incompetent, bankrupt, and failed strategies that there is. And we have not only decades, but centuries of this. And then you can come up with the question of, well, what would you do in the face of a Hitler? Or what would you do? Okay. One, you don't let systems develop to that extent. Two, you don't sit back and do nothing until it becomes that point. And three, if you want to discuss what you do at that point, that's fine. But we also need to discuss practically what you do in Afghanistan and Northeast Nigeria, where war waging strategies have cost billions and billions of dollars, have fueled violence, and have failed to actually bring solutions. Now, you can look at an intelligent security strategy where you would engage appropriate military and security measures in combination with practical solutions that actually address the underlying issues. But just to go back to Northeast Nigeria, in an area which the world hears about because of Boko Haram, in one of the states that is affected, Adamawa, an incredibly beautiful state, 86% of the killings and the violence are not about Boko Haram related violence or killings by the police and the army in relation to Boko Haram. They're about inter-community violence, often between herders and farmers, and increasingly between groups of different identity or religious affiliation. Now, we go on the ground directly to communities which are involved in those conflicts. And just to give the context, one of the communities we went to just days before had been involved in attacking a herder community and killing several of their cattle. We're with them that morning. That night, the herder community responds and burns down 5 of their houses. So this is the actual daily violence which is occurring on the ground, affecting communities. Now, the farmer community we met with said, this has to end. We want it to end. We want to come together with the herders and go back to how things were decades before, where we would talk together, we'd find solutions, we'd find ways of coexisting. The challenge is they don't trust going to the herder community. The herder community doesn't trust going to them. What you would actually need is peace teams which bring trusted and respected leaders from each side that can meet with them one-on-one, that can go to them, hear their issues, hear their grievances, what is upsetting them, why they're angry, what the other side is doing, what they want as solutions, and then earning the trust after listening to them, bring them together. Now, those processes cost hundreds to thousands of dollars. They bring about actual agreements between the parties involved. They may stop the violence at that moment. And then what we also have to understand is that's not enough. You need to be prepared for the next farming season, the next season when the cattle are being moved and conflicts that can come up. And you need to look at not only the issue that is in dispute at that moment, but do we have the proper grazing routes that are agreed upon and supported by all parties? Do we have water resources or veterinary support for the animals, or improved seeds and farming techniques that can help support the farmers? That is what peace building is about. It's about knowing the actual conditions on the ground, the actual issues which real people, real communities are in conflicts about, and finding practical solutions. It's not only what's on the front of newspapers and the headlines, the actual situations on the ground that are leading to the majority of violence and killing in the world today are situations like this where there are practical and real solutions. Mm-hmm. And we are not investing in them. Most people are not trained in them. Most governments don't know how to do them. So when I first met...
We don't even hear about them in the press. Yeah. When they occur, we don't know about them. I mean, I never heard... in Canada, my friend, even though you are, you have roots in Canada, I don't hear about what you're doing in Nigeria or in Syria, etc. We need to know about this work.
I also think that is my fault. That is our fault. That is one of the challenges for those of us in the field. In the last 20 years, we have been so deeply engaging, trying to work to address actual situations on the ground and real conflicts. We've become much better at the professional side of peace building, not the entire field. So it's a metaphor that I will always use for where we are at the moment is a mushroom. The field has become incredibly broader. There used to be a few dozen programs in universities. Today, there are several hundred. There used to be a few hundred individuals really engaged in the field. Today, there are tens of thousands. And there used to be a few dozen organizations. Now there are thousands of organizations. So the field has gotten broader, but most of it, the quality is very poor. And it's only a very narrow stock that really deeply understands how you do reconciliation and healing after the deep impact of violence, how you do effective early warning systems that actually link to effective policy and practice to address the conflicts and prevent violence. And in that case, there are dozens to maximum hundreds of individuals in the world who've really internalized it. But the knowledge for how to work on almost any aspect of peace building today in the field is actually there. We've gotten better at the professional, but there's two areas where we have absolutely failed in the last 20 plus years. One is to engage effectively enough at the political level for our governments and state institutions to understand these issues. It's incomparably better than it was 20 years ago, but is nowhere near where it needs to be. And the other is to engage with our publics, with our citizens, with our countries.
Well, to engage, I'm sorry to say it, with Peace Magazine, you and I haven't been in touch enough. And this is all material that should be in almost every issue of the magazine. So it's my fault, and I apologize.
No, you've been amazing at this. You have always invited,
my friend.
Welcome. And asked actively. And this is an example of it, because a lot of the people that are really active in this field were doing the work of a dozen people. And so before I had children, I was working 20-hour days, working often through the weekends. When I'm in the field, that's exactly what I do. Otherwise, if I'm at home, I'm working to the fullest I'm able, and then trying to be a good husband, a good father, and be as present with my family and my children as possible. So just finding the time to do that extra step that's needed for a critical area we're engaging with conflict, let alone to write articles about it and promote it further, is challenging. But what is exciting is there are, again, as I was saying, so many more people involved in this field. You can just go on YouTube, you can go looking at TED Talks, and you will find people that are engaging everywhere from dealing with preventing armed violence, overcoming gun violence in our cities, to the incredible work of organizations like Parents and the Families Forum, Parent Circle Families Forum in Israel, Palestine, which brings together parents, both Israeli and Palestinian, whose children have been killed by the war, by the ongoing violence, and families of those who've been killed. And they are continuing to work even through the worst periods of division and violence between Israel and Palestine. They're continuing to work to bring people together.
Yeah, beautiful. But I want to go to Syria before we, because I hear that you've been doing things in Syria, or were, And that strikes me as absolutely the most challenging possible place to try to do anything. I can hardly imagine anything constructive that can be accomplished in a zone of that kind. Tell me about that.
So I would actually say that sadly it's not the most challenging or the most difficult context. You have Syria, Yemen, Libya, the Congo. There are many very difficult situations where violence is really intense and where the conditions and the context for people engaging are incredibly difficult. I've had many of my friends and colleagues in Syria killed over the years. I have, just to be fully clear, I have not been working directly in Syria over the last years. Our organization has been working extensively with partners in Syria. And we've been working with partners both in areas that are in government control and outside government control. And what we've been engaging with them is to look at practically how has the war and the violence been affecting their societies, everything from looking at the economic and the physical infrastructure destruction to its impact on children, its impact on people's psychology and trauma, and to work to support a wide range of Syrian organizations on the ground that at the moment are really in survival mode. It's not talking about looking at a perfect solution. It's not talking about looking at a negotiated or a peaceful outcome. The war has largely been fought. It has largely been militarily won by one side, but the impacts of that war have devastated Syrian society. And while many people now change the channel and governments are in their disputes over now Russia needs to handle the recovery, we're going to step back, the reality is the millions upon millions of people on the ground in Syria are living in horrible conditions. And what is going to be needed is a long-term process of support for stabilization and recovery, and to try and deal with the unbelievably difficult process of healing the impacts and effects of the war on people's lives, on a society which has been ripped apart, where hate and demonization of the other have been fueled at a level that did not exist before the war, where you have had tens upon tens of thousands of people involved in armed groups as combatants for a range of different organizations, from pro-government to opposition forces. And now how do you bring those people back into daily life? How do you engage to have safety and security for those who are under opposition-controlled areas that have now been taken over by the government?
Is there even any effort to do that, or are they just waiting till the
There's no real effort.
Ended? Because, I mean, it's hard to imagine how you could go in as with a humanitarian operation to try to rebuild anybody's house, for example, or anything of that kind right now.
There are some organizations on the ground working from a humanitarian and a physical recovery point of view. There will definitely be money flooded in from different wealthy actors, and you'll probably have capturing the process of physical recovery like was done in Lebanon. Some interest groups will grow incredibly wealthy off of the rebuilding of Syrian cities, but that doesn't mean that the lives of people will be rebuilt, or that the conditions of millions of refugees in countries around Syria, and the tiny number that were taken up in other countries in Europe and elsewhere by comparison, doesn't mean that that will be addressed. And when you're asking, is that being done? I would say what we're seeing is a level of such a total irresponsibility and non-serious engagement by governments around the world that are not looking at how can we really support recovery and peace building in Syria. While we have actively fueled the war, our countries provided weapons, our countries provided funding, provided training to different parties. And this is the old menu that we're used to ordering from. We know how to do that. We know how to support dictatorships. We know how to sell weapons. Canada is very good at that. We know how to provide support for different actors and regimes. But when it comes to the deep work of peace building, and what's interesting, since you're in the context of in Canada, and I was born in Halifax as part of my background, even though I've lived most of my life working in the field abroad internationally, I was inspired to engage in peace building and to work to address these issues in the world, in large part because of my education, culture, and upbringing growing up in Canada. Mm-hmm. I grew up in a context where we were taught that you deal with the problems that the world is facing.
That was in the old days. It's harder now.
It's true, because the reality is that there was a period where Canada was really a leading actor I mean, one, the huge old days that we all hear of from the time of involvement in peacekeeping, which Canada does almost nothing to support at all whatsoever anymore. To the days in the 90s where we had a fantastic team at the Foreign Ministry and at the Canadian Development Agency, CEDA, which were really supporting and funding peacebuilding. Canada was leading. Whereas today, it really is virtually non-existent. It is not engaging. And here's what's interesting, because I know we don't have that much longer, but when we're speaking about conflicts and violence, some of the things we have to recognize is the impact of violence and war is incredibly destructive. You can see that in Syria, Yemen, Libya, Nigeria, the Congo, all over, or also in inner cities and in cities in the United States and other countries that have huge levels of gun violence. There's the human impact, there's the impact on our societies, there's the economic impact. There's an Institute for Economics and Peace that calculates that the lost income and the destruction caused by war is costing us, I believe the latest figure is $14.7 trillion. At the same time, peace building is incredibly effective. It helps to create the conditions of stability and security in which people can lead their lives. When you develop early warning systems and you can identify conditions and causes and drivers of violence and conflict years before they become violent, and you can then engage to help make sure that that violence never happens. This enables people to go to school, live their lives, do their jobs. The countries which do the best economically are those which have higher levels of peace and stability and good governance. This is something, again, as I said earlier, it's as real as medicine, but we're in a bit of a situation like where medicine was in the 14th century. So maybe we've come a little bit further. We need to get the knowledge out there. We need, as citizens, to say there's some things we're not going to stand for. We don't want Canada to continue to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia or to help to fuel the ongoing carnage and war in Yemen. We want our countries, our governments, ourselves to come up with more intelligent, more effective solutions. We have been championing innovations and improvements in human life throughout centuries. We've never in the history of our species have we had the innovative and creative capacity, the technological capacity that we have today. We have the ability for solutions. We need to start recognizing that these old systems, war is in the category of colonialism, slavery, and apartheid. It is a dysfunctional and bankrupt system, unable to in any way solve actual issues and problems in our world today. I have huge respect for individuals who are in security services, individuals in armed forces, who are very often there to try and do the best to help guarantee security and well-being and safety for people they love, people they care about, for their citizens, for their countries. And many of them recognize and will be the first to say that what we actually need are intelligent and effective solutions.
Look, on the one hand, we're talking about the fact that the amount of investment or attention and help given to peace building is a tiny, tiny fraction of the amount that is being spent on all the destructive things. On the other hand, you have built quite an institution there, my friend. I'm just dazzled looking at your website and seeing all the kinds of things that you are doing. And you created this pretty much yourself from the get-go. All right, tell me who's behind all this. Who are your friends? Who are helping you? Do you have support in Europe? Or do you just have somehow, did you inherit a lot of money and decide to put it all into your PATRIR? What's going on there and how did you build this outfit? Mm-hmm.
So the first thing that really needs to be clear, PATRIR was not built by me. PATRIR is built by the work of dozens of individuals who are incredible, that are engaging every single day, just like organizations.
You started it.
It was started by 3 different people. I was just one of them. And then just as an example, months after the Institute was begun, myself and my wife, 2 of the original individuals involved, we had to leave because of a death in our family, my father's passing. And so we'd begun the Institute knowing that it takes about 10 years to really build an institution well, at least 4 years to get it solid on the ground. And we had to leave after about 3 to 4 months. And we went to my students at the university at the time, and we told them, we need to leave, but we can continue to support the building if you want to keep it going. And we had students move into the attic of the institute and live there over the next year and a half, nearly 2 years, to keep the work going because they felt it was important. And they also helped to begin one of the largest and most significant environmental movements in the history of Romania as a country, the Salvați Roșia Montana, Save Roșia Montana, which is an environmental movement working to protect an area at threat from a massive Canadian company coming in using mining techniques that are illegal in Canada, illegal in most of
I think we had an article about that 2 or 3 years ago.
Many did, and there's over in the world. But no, it's still ongoing. But just to address the question you asked specifically in terms of who supports us. So our support is minimum. We have won the World Vision International Peace Prize in 2011 with more letters written in support of PATRIR than every other organization in the history of the prize put together. Wow. We won the 2017 Luxembourg International Peace Prize for Outstanding Peace Organization. And we are just one amongst thousands of extraordinary organizations that are doing this work in their communities, in their countries, on the ground, all over the world, and working with often incredibly limited resources. So the average salary of most of our team is minuscule. In fact, if you put our entire team together at PATRIR, it's less than one average salary in Canada, what we all make in terms of income, all of us put together in a year. But we have a brilliant and dedicated team. We were asked once by a German intern who was just starting at the Institute, how would you describe PATRIR? And what we said for the first time in that moment has stuck with us ever since. It is passion plus professionalism dedicated to a purpose. Our funding, because we believe there needs to be total transparency in this. In the beginning, I could make enough giving a 10-minute speech in Western Europe to fund the Institute for a month. But that was back in the early 2000s, and costs of living in Romania were different. We have a training center, and it provides world.
Sorry, but when you talked about your students moved in, who were these students? Did you already have this training center going, or how did you have students?
The Institute had just been created. It was the first international organization in Romania's history. It's based in Cluj, but works all over the world. And at that point, it had begun. We had the Gandhi Peace Library. We had a number of programs. We were already involved in the process in Nepal in the midst of the civil war there. And the students, when I arrived in Cluj, a wonderful head of the political science faculty at the time invited me to teach a class which I think technically had 12 registered students who could get credit and take the exam for the course. But we opened it up, and I had about 140 to 150 students coming every single week. We usually had about a dozen faculty coming from different departments as well. And we had 48 students who took the exam at the end of the course, in addition to the 12 who were required to, even though these 48 couldn't get credit for it, but they did it for the credit.
They just like taking tests.
They did it because they wanted to do something that made themselves proud. And that was why people moved in and started the Institute, because they felt it was necessary. And actually early on in the early years of the Institute, back in 2002, we walked across Romania by foot. We went from Cluj to Bucharest. Our route was about 500 kilometers by foot, longer than Gandhi's Salt March. And the aim was to listen to people, to see what was happening in people's lives, and to listen to what people wanted in the country. And many of those involved were actually the students from that first course. And many of them have gone on and continued to work in Romania or internationally ever since. Because when they saw what was happening, they felt they needed to do something about it. And that's what PATRIR is about. We do get some funding from the European Commission for supporting programs to address radicalization and violent extremism in Europe. When we work abroad, the funding has to come from within that context. It can be the United Nations, it can be national organizations, international agencies, it's partners who are inviting us. So we only, according to our charter, can only raise funds for work we do either domestically in Romania or global issues. But when we're working in countries, the funds have to be controlled by the partners there. And I mean, just to give an example, the entire process that played a major role contributing to the ceasefire in Nepal during the civil war cost just under 40,000 US dollars. There are programs which are funded to millions of dollars in this field globally, and there are resources there, but there needs to be a lot more. And we also need to be working to make sure that people in government offices, people in security forces, people in foreign ministries are actually properly trained in how to deal with conflicts effectively. A lot of the time we'd assume that they are. There's some brilliant individuals, very skilled, very dedicated, very knowledgeable. But I remember, for example, a meeting in Mexico, in the city that had the highest rate of murder in Mexico, one of the highest rates in the world. And I was asked to do a program with the security forces and the police in that city. And the program began after lunch. And the police, these were captains of police units, members of different departments and squads that were tasked with addressing violence and addressing the drug trade in the city. One of the units that came in had just come out of a battle with one of the largest drug gangs, and one of the people who's supposed to be in the workshop had been killed that morning. And they had been involved in a live fire situation. In this space, what we were addressing is what were the actual conditions of violence in the country, what was giving rise to it, how was it affecting people, and then how was it being addressed. And the head of the unit that had come straight from a gun battle that morning stood up and said, "We know what we're doing doesn't work. We know mano dura, we know the hard military approach and response is only fueling more violence in our country. We know because we're the ones that are doing it and are at the front line of it, and it's our lives that are on the line. But the problem we face is we don't get any better solutions from our government." And this is what we see all over the world. We need to begin studying violence, and we have already begun, but we need to do this much more, exactly the way we study diseases. We need to look for evidence-based approaches and to improve policy and practice based upon learning from what works, putting the resources that are needed into it, and ensuring that the people involved are trained and that the agencies and institutions that are addressing different aspects of a problem are coming together in multi-stakeholder forums and joint operating centers so that we can pool our analysis, pool our understanding, and improve our response. The capabilities and the potential are there, but it is not happening yet. But then when you step back to what we were discussing earlier, and you look at the system challenges that we're facing in governance, in an economic system in crisis, in an environmental system in crisis, what's interesting is peacebuilding actually holds the answer to many of those as well.
Absolutely.
It's about how you find effective and optimal solutions, how you engage stakeholders, how you analyze and understand the systems and the challenges, the root causes, conditions, and drivers of problems, and you find practical and effective solutions.
Everybody would see the value of having peace education in schools. Well, what I think we need to do more is peace education of the world. Things like publicity, the press, and even these videos. I mean, before we can get people to watch these, unfortunately, very long videos, because they're too long, and we got to figure out the solution to that. But we need to get your video in front of, a few million people. So I'm going to work on that.
To those who are listening, because this is one of the things that really excites me. We need to reach out to the world. We need to reach out to people in other fields, artists, designers, programmers, people in IT, people in communications, because we need to have their passion, their knowledge, their skills to help get these messages out. When you're saying that we all recognize the value of peace education, I think most people don't even know it exists or know what it is at the moment, and we need to make.
They wouldn't argue against it, but some people would argue for it, but what they don't necessarily do is go farther and say, this is peace education of the public, and we need that too.
We need both. We need peace education schools, peace education our societies, and we need to educate and train our government officials and our frontline practitioners and responders. It's interesting, the World Economic Forum every year does a report on what they say are the competencies we need for our future economic directions and developments. And if you look at core skills they identify, it's things like managing risk, complex problem solving, collaboration, teamwork, the things that you gain through peace education that are not there. And
you've just been making the best pitch I've heard yet for exactly what kind of investment that people should be making. And it's just inspiring to hear you. Absolutely wonderful. Thank you. And our time is up. Bless you, dear.
Thank you for the work that you do, Metta, because it has been an inspiration to me from before I began in this field, and is one of the reasons that I began in this field. What you and others in Pugwash and the peace research and peace movement in Canada and around the world did over decades and continues to be an inspiration. And if there's anyone who's watching this video who is actively involved in this field, or who has felt motivated or inspired, or has some idea that you would like to do something, or has an idea of what you could do, please really don't hesitate to be in touch.
Blessings, Kai. Bye.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.